participated in the storytelling series. Sharing our stories is so important to understanding ourselves and the world that we live in. And thanks to Off the Beaten Path, thank you, Izzy. Izzy was so kind to do this, and I appreciate the support very much from the bookstore. Selling one's book is a very challenging thing, and independent bookstores, as you all know, tend to be a vanishing breed. So, and Off the Beaten Path is a gift to our community. So. And then I'd like to thank each and every one of you for joining me. I know there are a lot of fine things to do in the summertime in Steamboat besides being here at noon. So I appreciate that you've chosen to join in a conversation about how a place does enrich our lives and the place that we live. Hey, Katie?
Oh, yes.
I thought I'd give you a little roadmap as we journey through the idea of place. First, I'll talk a little bit about my book, its where it came from, its creation, and its focus. We'll get to nuts and bolts of place, elements of place. We all kind of know what those are in a very basic way, but we'll kind of outline them again just to remind ourselves. And then I'm going to have you help me answer the question, how does place enrich our lives? How does that happen? On the face of it, it could be a pretty simple answer. But as we think about it, there's some other things that are going on. We will talk about affinity for landscape, the idea of affinity, that we each individually, I think, have a sense of a space or a place that feels comfortable to us. And then we'll do some, I hope, kind of freewheeling exploration as a group and sharing in ideas and feelings we have for different landscapes that we inhabit. Okay. My collection of essays titled Apertures is about my life in North Route in the heart of the Elk River Valley, where my husband and I have ranched for over 40 years. My book is a memoir written as a collection of essays in which I recorded the details of our daily ranching life, my wanderings in the natural world, and at this stage in my life, the challenges of aging and mortality. Many of the seeds of the essays from my daily work from my daily writing practice, which I do every morning. I write one page. Sometimes it's gobbledygook. Sometimes it's something that I keep that might develop into some other further writing. Sometimes there are just fragments in my daily writing that then I place into other work. I frequently go back and kind of scan it for things like that if I'm looking for something for an essay. As I developed the seeds for these essays, the rough draft of the collection became my master's thesis for my MFA at Regis University, which I completed in 2019. Finding a publisher was challenging, particularly through the pandemic. From my submission to Shanty Arts Publishing, who published Apertures, to their acceptance of my manuscript, to its release last September, took almost 2 years. So I'd like to read a couple of short excerpts that'll give you a sense of the 3 threads that I've woven throughout the book: our ranching life, the natural world, and aging and mortality. The first essay is titled A Scaffold. And this is about the weight of the work on the ranch and how routine is really helpful to that. And I first came across this sense when I watched a little gray squirrel on my back deck. Last September, I noticed a few tan pine cones in my flower pots on the back deck. I wondered if they'd dropped from the limbs of 2 nearby spruce trees, but they were arranged beneath the fading fern and pansies as though stowed on purpose. I checked again a couple days later and found the stashes had grown, nearly overflowing the ceramic rims of each pot. I was soon suspicious of a new resident to the ranch. Over the last several years, we've seen new animal life, some passing through, others settling in. The list is short to date, but includes antelope, European pine marten, the golden eagle, and the gray squirrel. We see the migratory antelope wander in and out of the spring meadows and again come fall. One spring morning, a few years ago, a marten peeked out from behind a cottonwood as I watched from the kitchen sink. He'd spied a small sparrow's nest in an old wooden birdhouse hanging from the tree. The golden eagle nested here this summer, south of the house in the cottonwoods, its raptor wail captivating enough to put a pause in my day. Later, we followed the eaglet's maiden voyages to the thermals on the hill. And now I watch the daily comings and goings of my suspect, the gray squirrel. Gray squirrels have been known to gather up 10 to 10,000 pine cones in a season. As they gather, they hide their bounty in small caches. Our resident gray squirrels are scatter hoarders, while others, often deep in the woods, are larder hoarders, stashing pine cones, acorns, berries, insects, and seeds in large mounds mixed with forest debris called middens. My suspect scattered his stash until he could take it to a safe place near his dray, a nest built from sticks and leaves and wrapped with long strands of grass. It was a temporary arrangement, part sleight of hand, part energy-saving device, to get the most gathering done on any given day. Within a week of my initial sighting of the small cones, they had disappeared. Even though the gunmetal gray runner on the rail is a rodent, I find myself watching him with delight as he travels along the top fence rail, safe from most prey except the eagle and hawk. His superhighway takes him from pine tree to pine tree as he scavenges for pine cones, returning home to his stray in the cottonwoods. In my observations, I've concluded his daily work is predictable, his work ethic industrious, his commute firmly established. I admire the rail runner. His routine accomplishes what Nicole Walker writes of constancy. A well-worn routine is a life capable of heavy lifting. The gray squirrel ensures his survival by the lifting of a winter's worth of pine cones, carried in stages, from loose cones to sequestered cones to cones finally safe in the cache of the stray. Walker's observation follows me throughout my days. It follows Pete, too. The seasonal routines secure a scaffold for the heavy lifting of our ranch work. Most years it sets in motion in May after the meadows give up their wet fleece. The first chores insist on attention, a clearing away of the deep winters so summer may unfold. Pete and I both began with chores to reorder our landscapes, awaken the earth, and open waterways. Each day it's as though we breathe life into preparations for the summer solstice. The first task to call out to Pete is the restoration of the fence lines. He and his hired hand load up the ATV with wire, fence stretchers, staples, and tough work gloves to fix broken fence lines that succumb to winter's deep snows. Once the fence is secure, livestock can be moved in for grazing, and horses are safe in their home meadows. Next, the John Deere fires up, and the meadows are brought to life by harrowing, a deep raking, disturbing the earth and grass. Once the harrow tines release the hold of old meadow growth, May's light washes over the smallest of young grass shoots. Once the harrow tines pierce the hard earth, it accepts nitrogen and rain. And finally, Pete hooks up the ditcher to the John Deere PTO, the power takeoff, and heads out to the irrigation ditches. It's there he drags through the waterways, through old remnants of timothy, brome, and slough, clearing the artery, the lifeline, soon filled with icy waters. The next one I'd like to read from, I've titled The Face of Loss. The story is often told that for those of us who live and work or grow up around animal life, the lessons of life and death come naturally. For over 30 years, Pete and I have witnessed the deaths of family dogs and cats, cows, calves, foals, and mares. Over time, after the passing of Toby, Bernie, Casey, Bucky, Badger, Boogie, Brute, and Stan, our family dogs, and the loss of our ranch horses, Mighty, Angie, Dudley, Vegas, Daddy's Girl, and others, I found death is familiar to me, but it hasn't yet come naturally to me. Instead, when we lose an animal or loved one, I find myself heading to the river, where a small sandy beach invites one to enter the stream, lined on both sides with dogwood and cottonwood. There, near the lap of the waterway, eager to be in its possession, I hope its determined current will take up my sorrow, might wash the pain of powerlessness and grief away. Money?
Well, I don't have to sit here.
Hi, Jen. We're glad you're here. Here you go.
There are 3 sections that follow in this essay. The first one is about Pete's favorite mare. The second one is about our favorite kitty. And the third section is about the death of my mother. On an icy winter deep in January, my sister and I returned from dinner to our mother's room, where she lay, we knew, near death. We sat close and read from her Bible. Her breathing is noisy, or was it labored? I'm not sure. She lays quietly, comfortable thanks to hospice care. Within 10 minutes or so of our return, she takes her last breath. My sister turns to me and asks, is she gone? Is that it? Yes, she's gone. She's gone. My sister had never seen anyone die. I knew in her question, oddly, that I was familiar with death in a way many others are not. I'd watched our animal friends, and I'd witnessed my mother-in-law take her last breath 2 years before. I knew in my experience that the very act of witnessing and being present becomes a gift in the following days. The going out of the spirit is so clear. The physical body, as it lays in the aftermath of the release, is truly a shell, the housing of a being who no longer resides in their earthly home. This too, in a contradictory way, comforts. I see death, I know death, and in the experiential moment deep inside, my heart attests to the fact. Father John, a Lutheran pastor, visited my mother each day the last week of her life. When he came to her bedside, he comforted with prayers out of a little leather book. His recitation was chant-like, as though no one needn't know the words to feel its reassurance. I imagined my mother, unconscious, heard the care in his words. As I sat and listened, waves of grief washed over me. When Father John turned to leave, he offered, "Grief is love remembered, is it not?" Looking back, the wound of mortality, the wound of losing a beloved mother or animal companion is softened by the truth in Father John's question. I find relief in embracing my grief. When I do, I have an odd sensation that it is elevated. As it rises, I feel my heart lighten. And in the accompaniment of the knowing, being familiar with death, I'm encouraged to go on, looking to the periodic rise of memory as antidote. So it's not surprising that place is a topic I've selected to discuss today. Place played a large role in my writing. I purposely chose to write about my life with a sense of gratitude for the place that I had inhabited for so long. And as I wrote, I wanted to clearly set the scene for my reader, for I always want my reader to join me. I want the reader to know and feel the place of my story. For all of us, place sets the stage, provides the container for the storytelling of our lives. And when we tell those stories, we set the stage for those who are listening with time, age, location, weather, landscape, and so on. So let's take a look at those elements of place. So nothing too surprising on the physical landscape side. And I don't know if there's something I'm missing in that list. And there's another landscape that we live in, and that's the communal or the cultural landscape. And place, the umbrella of place, really is the intersection of the two. Now I can be just in the physical landscape and experience that, and I can be just in the communal one. But the whole of the place for me in my life is a meeting of the two. So societies and cultures have always been formed by their relationship to the physical world, and if we think about that, any group of humans ever, their life, their traditions, their history was dictated by the landscape in which they lived, because they had to work with it in order to live and to survive. I recently saw a PBS special on, I think there were 5 or 6 Native American regions, and they talked about each one of them. And the Seminoles in Florida had different history, traditions, practices than the Iroquois in New York. 2 different landscapes, 2 different locations. Character of landscape shapes the behavior and identity of inhabitants, becoming the history, the traditions, the way of life, and community development. Okay, Katie. Okay. So, what drives our desire to a particular place? Sometimes we have a choice. Maybe we don't have a choice for our daily living, but on vacation or a choice to go out and access other landscapes or travel, we may have an affinity for other kinds of landscape as well. But in my exploration of all this, I think we all have an affinity that may be conscious or unconscious for a landscape. I feel fortunate that I'm living in a landscape that I prefer, that I am stirred by the landscape in which I live. So here are some landscapes. I imagine there's some other more particular ones. A little later we'll talk about among you, what kind of landscape you're most comfortable in, what resonates with you. Okay, Katie. So we're going to dive in a little bit deeper to the idea of a primal landscape. I'm going to read you just a real short essay on two different ideas about the idea that we do have a primal landscape in our brain that's not really conscious, that it got formed someplace, somehow. This comes from the opening essay in the book Denizen. The epigraph quote says, "Tell me the landscape in which you live, and I will tell you who you are." I was once told that the landscape in which you were born remains with you as though imprinted deep in the newborn brain. I was born on the high plains of Santa Barbara, Chihuahua, Mexico, but I've never desired a return to dry, high ground. My first fondness for a landscape was as a child wishing I were Heidi in the children's story by the same name. In my mind, she lived in the perfect wonderland, orphaned and living with her paternal grandfather in the Swiss Alps. Whatever potency the early imprint may or may not have made in Mexico, that first draw to an alpine landscape never left me. For over 40 years, I've lived on a ranch in northwestern Colorado within minutes of snow-covered mountains and a rugged continental divide. When they're in sight, I imagine that I possess their strength, and for an instant, their immortality. The Elk River runs not far from my bedroom window, and when I hear it at night, I'm soothed by its presence. In the blue spruce forest and aspen groves where I wander, I never fail to hear Ralph Waldo Emerson's words. In the woods, we return to reason and faith. And in the valley, the open meadowlands most often ring out to me as though to say, anything is possible. So, the idea that we'll talk a little more for each of you, if the landscape in which you were born had an imprint, or Scott Russell Sanders, this comes from his collection of essays in Earthworks, and he gets really specific here when he says one's primal landscape may be any terrain that one explores between the ages of 5 and 6 and 12 or 14, whether or not one happens to have been born there. So two different ideas. So I can come to this and say, I'm not sure I was 6 when I heard the Heidi story, but I also was around then, and at 12, I was one of the first in my family to learn how to ski. And that was it. That's where I wanted to be. So I'll ask you this question. No one has to offer an answer, but if you might just think about this, maybe you've already identified it, what your primal landscape and how it came about, if the idea fits for you. Did anyone feel as though the landscape in which they were born was the one? 2 brave souls back there. And the rest of you, it happened at another time. There was a seminal moment, there was a moment in which somehow, whether it was conscious or unconscious, you said, I'm at home here. Okay. Interesting. Okay. All right. I'm giving you a definition for enrich. We kind of know what it means. I was kind of curious about this definition because it wasn't quite what I expected. But to make rich or richer, especially by the addition or increase of some desirable quality, attribute, or ingredient to add beauty. So something that enhances whatever it is that we're finding enriching. So when I thought about this, I thought, how does this actually happen? On the face of it, this question is easy for us here in the Yampa Valley, like a question for an open book test. All we have to do is look out the window, walk out the door, go to the museum, to the library, stream, out to the open lands, ranches, and so on. We know, whether we're articulating or not, that we live in a rich environment. But to receive the enrichment or the gifts of place, I believe we have to enter into some kind of relationship with the place, with the landscape. We seek what we are drawn to and receive the gifts in turn. Place does not act on us passively. Something is resonating. There's an interaction somehow, consciously or unconsciously. So, and I think this happens in two different ways, or can. Through our senses and physical presence, we come to know the physical landscape. And through our natural desire to belong, to find our people, we know our cultural landscape. But we have to be willing to engage in both that physical landscape and the cultural or communal landscape. So, I'll read a real brief. This is a little excerpt about my wanderings in the natural world and my connection to the natural world, and sort of an idea of my engagement with it and how it's been imprinted on me. After snowshoeing to the top of a nearby hillside on the ranch, our dog Emma, a Boston Terrier, and Grizz, a blue heeler border collie cross, and I linger. We follow our own rituals. When we arrive, if the winds are quiet, Grizz and Emma hunt for scents among the sagebrush, perhaps noting whether a coyote or fox or elk had traveled over the ridge. On other days, when winds out of the west rustle my jacket, Emma and Grizz stand at my feet. Emma's eyes settle on the track headed back home, and Grizz turns away from the snowstorm rushing through Long Gulch. Today the winds whistle and my ritual begins. In familiar phrases, I repeat the names of the landmarks marking the terrain. In between blinks, a kind of snowflake dodgeball, I imagine the Elk River Valley below and the rugged edge of the Zirkle Wilderness to the northwest, hidden below the low-lying clouds. In my mind's eye, I follow the Elk River as it meanders, crisscrossing meadowlands where our cattle and horses feed, before it turns out to view near Red Dirt Trail. To the south, I scan Elk Mountain, standing unchallenged, a sentry at the foot of the valley floor. Soon Long Gulch draws my eye to the west, its rolling hills inhabited every quarter mile with a neighbor's home. In the recitation and incantation of the contours of my home, a home I've come to know, a home imprinted, not just a backdrop, but a living landscape fused into my heart. Emma shakes beneath her coat as the storm pushes east across the summit. It's time to descend. Reluctant, I set out onto the trail. In the first few steps, I carry a ticker tape filled with the images, the Zirkle's cloudy shroud, a curling band of mother cows feeding in the meadow, a cotton-lined Elk River disappearing into the valley's end, a stalwart Elk Mountain, and my extended neighborhood nestled in the hillsides of Long Gulch. A creature of habit, I took away the landscape as if it were my very own possession, and follow Emma and Grizz on down the trail toward home. So, engagement with the physical landscape, and I'll read a little excerpt for an essay titled In Cathedral Light. As part of the community in North Route, we have some traditionals and rituals over the years. Some have remained, some have changed, and so on. But Jay knows about this particular ritual. In the spring, we have a friend who does a bonfire to celebrate the end of winter and the spring equinox. And we did it, it's been done for over 20 years. I can't remember how many total, 20 to 25 years. So our children have grown up with this ritual. And we were all invited to bring something to throw into the inferno that we had carried all winter. Early on, I won't read that. I'm going to read that, so I won't tell you about that. But anyway, this is about a ritual, community, friends and family. We watch our kids grow up and all of that. But we are in we were communing. As the fire settles and slows from its eruption, we stand in its warmth. The adults communing, the children boisterous with snowballs and wrestling in a snowpack where no one gets hurt, either made snug in a pocket or in a hand. Most of us carry a token of a winter burden. In the early years, long underwear or worn-out work gloves were often tossed in. School-age children might have sent a flurry of papers, old tests, or the effigy of a difficult teacher into the inferno. It's not always said what goes into the fire. Men seldom surrender. Imagine that, a symbol of their winter. On occasion, I may pursue what's on their mind and ask, so what would you throw in? Recently, a rancher, an old friend, said, the month of January. However, most of the women write theirs down. With each season, the burdens shift. In memory of losing her mother one year, a friend sent a copy of her mother's sheet music into the flame. Several years ago, I carried a file representative of the red tape of my mother's estate, onerous all winter long. Another friend writes in small script on a remnant of paper her grief over the loss of her family's Kansas farm. Carefully folded or simply carried bare, the tokens are delivered as close to the heat as possible. Then with a quick fling, they're gone. Each year, I hold my token away from the fire before I throw it in. I reflect on its presence in my life as I stand between the light of the inferno and the dark of night. As though in prayer, I know the feeling when the token is consumed. The temporal and precious space for transformation in the meditation disappears too. As I commune with others in the heat, I stand in the light of a cathedral. I find it's not just the releasing of the token that night or the winter weight taken up in the smoke and ash of the blast, but the ritual of preparing for the fire and standing with the children and old friends that fashions the renewal. As the fire begins to ease and the night grows deeper into the woods beyond the flame, we turn back to the house, our procession quiet, as though peace settled over the bootjack and visited each one of us. Okay. Your turn. And however this works for everybody, I don't want anybody to be uncomfortable or whatever. But just a little sort of survey discussion about when I was thinking about this, I thought, well, I shouldn't make it specific to Yampa Valley, and it's easy to do. But many of you have other landscapes that you may visit or live in. A lot of you, I know, do live here. But I'm wondering if there's a certain identity, some kind of identity here in this cultural, physical landscape that you've found an attachment or something that you've attached to. What drew you here? What keeps you here? Anybody want to volunteer?
When I was 12 or 13, I had a brother 5 years older. I have a brother 5 years older. He was looking at colleges, and one of the colleges that we visited was Colorado College in Colorado Springs. I looked around and I said to my parents, I'm going to move here to Colorado. This is gorgeous.
You just knew.
I just knew, yeah,
Physical.
I just knew. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Anybody else have a special attachment to place? It can be really small, it can be big. Susu.
I think my attachment to a place includes somewhere that has changes of seasons. And that's important to me, is just to not be stuck in maybe one place, but for it to evolve through the year.
So there's change, and I think there's an energy in the changing of the seasons. There's also a relief.
Yeah, exactly.
When some pass, so it's
Starting
this
and ending and
cycle.
cycle.
I'm with you completely. Yeah, I find it very invigorating.
So that makes it, I mean, I live in a mountainous area, I live in Salt Lake City, Utah, so, we have the changes of seasons there and the mountains, which I've always felt comfortable in, but this valley makes me feel comfortable too because it has those same, that same essence.
maybe in a more specific way, are there any places in Yampa Valley that you have an affinity for, like you go to? Like, I recently heard a story about a gentleman up in North Route who had a very particular place he went to, and I don't think many people knew about it, but he called it his point of contemplation. And he wanted it preserved. And the whole story is not really important, but it was preserved. But it was his spot. I have my spot on the top of the hill that I wander on. For you in the Yampa Valley, I mean, there's some, might be on the river, might be up on the mountain.
I think sunrises and sunsets in the lakes, around the lakes, or any body of water in the mountains. And when I walk from our place down to the river, the Yampa River, I'm through the trees in a certain spot. I go, into your presence I come, O Lord, and thanking you. And I'm just filled with joy.
Isn't that amazing?
So it's hard to go back to Texas, except for grandkids and great-grands and kids.
Yeah. So I have a question for you. I wasn't going to pose, I hadn't planned on it, but it's something that I thought about discussing. The idea that we come to landscapes at intersections in our lives, through moves, marriage, job, whatever. I came here when I was 28, expecting my first child. We had looked here 2 years before we decided to come. But we knew from childhood, particularly my husband, knew from childhood that there was a fondness for Steamboat Springs. I came as an adolescent and had fondness for Steamboat Springs. So out of the memory, and how many stories have you heard? I came here as a kid. I always wanted to come back, and so on. And then there came an intersection in life where, in our case, we had a choice to come here. Has there been an intersection? Are there intersections for each of you that brought you here? Are there memories from before or reasons why you ended up here?
I didn't want to die in Texas. Die in Colorado.
That's an intersection. Yeah. Pat?
I think maybe water, bodies of water. When I was a little girl, we lived in Greeley and we were a block and a half from Parkwood Lake. And we would cut through the neighbors' yards and go down and throw rocks at the fishes. Now I see little kids doing that in Casey's Pond because I'm in independent living out there. And I think, oh, I remember that exactly. And their dad will be fishing on the dock and they'll be throwing rocks into the water. And then my parents had a cabin which we then inherited on the Big Thompson, is south of Estes. So it was always either a lake or a river. And then our most beloved home up here was in Mack Creek Village, right at the junction of the Elkin, Mack Creek. Some of you that know the area, we bought Eddie Dismute's little house right at Mack Creek Village, and then we made it a little bigger. There were 4 of us and 1 of her. And now, here I am in old age on Katie's Pond. And there was something magic and peaceful, and yet, pardon me, people would tell me, oh, I do this.
Did you some more?
I have some. There are definitely sick people in this room, and no, I just do this. I'm sorry. But the water is always there. It's always different, but it's always there. And now I just panic about Lake Powell being empty and Palm Springs being made green with our water. You know, so I'm a Colorado native. But I think of the water because we are a dry state and rivers and lakes are precious. When I was a little kid between the big dogs, we always picnicked at Bear Lake.
Yeah, water, and the sound of water. I almost can't even describe what it is that goes on in hearing the water and the motion. I think what I'd like to do is go on to the next slide, Katie. So, there's so much here, I think, and I think that probably lots of different landscapes and communities. There's a lot to value, a lot that enriches has been added to our lives. And if we know what those things are, I'm not going to, this is a question for a whole nother conversation, but it is a conversation that's going on everywhere. If we value things, if we know that that enriches our lives, we don't want to lose them, how is it that we can protect them and preserve them? Is there one thing in this area for each of you? Do any of you have one particular place that you worry about that isn't going to be preserved, that you would like to be preserved? An activity here that you would like to be preserved? Anyone?
The quality of the water in the area
Mm-hmm.
and flow and tourism. That's big for me. Just the idea of fresh, pure water anywhere in the world, and this is our
We're very
true.
very fortunate. Anybody else?
I think downtown deserves to be preserved. A lot of the buildings that were built 100 years ago are there just by the grace of the owner. And as we have seen over the past forever, but also the last 20 years, we're at the owner's whim on if they stay or not, including the homes downtown and the way they appear and their size and how the windows are has a gigantic impact on how we understand the place. And as they get replaced by very different looking buildings and different sized buildings, it is impacting how we understand our past.
Thank you for that, Katie. It's so true. Brooke?
Well, because I grew up in the city, one of the things that just has been always so amazing to me, and when I grew up in the city, always loved Western history. But now living up here and knowing so many families that have ranches and truly the work ethic and then what you share with the generations, it's unfortunate that that way of life is not as abundant as it used to be. So I would love to see that preserved because the culture behind it as well is so incredible. And also it teaches the next generation some really wonderful lessons about life. So that's one part that I've thought about quite a bit. Just getting to know you guys so much more. And pretty passionate about it too, which is fun.
Yeah. Jay and Marcia, I hesitate to call your names. Hello. I do want to say this. Most of you know Jay Fetcher. I wrote a first collection of essays, and in that book I talk a lot about protection of the open lands in the Elk River Valley. And thanks to Jay and his father and Steve Stranahan, the river valley is essentially protected. And that started in 96, were the first conversations in
94.
94? Yeah. Thank you again, and again, and again. Marcia?
No. I've spoken.
I'm not cutting you off, Jay. You can speak some more about this idea that Brooke's talking about.
Well, your question about place does go back to the answer of seasons, because seasons are so important to me, because it's so good mentally. And the challenge it presents agriculturally mentally. And it's most of the time positive, except for last spring. With calving season and the fencing season we went through, which we're still going through with fences. So, and water is important, and so we're lucky to be here.
Would you mind, speaking of traditions in North Route, would you like to share the tradition of measuring the meadows?
Oh. There's two kind of spring rituals. One is the first day of spring? You usually measure the snow, and then how many inches that is. It's a day, an inch for when the meadows bear off. We've done it 100% wrong every year. And the other thing we've done for 70 years is write the date down when the meadows bear off in the spring. And fascinating 70-year history of dates and how much it's changed in the last 10 years versus the 50s. There is an impact of global change causing that. So,
But what a wonderful ritual.
yes,
Changing of the seasons, also the history of it,
yeah.
and the tracking the data and all of that. I have to confess, Jay, we do that as well, as you know. We do it a few days later than you do, but we're not like 100% wrong, I want to say. But Jay and I talked about this because this year was so unusual. We had so much snow. My daughter and I measured our meadows on March 25th or something. We had 46.5 inches on the meadow. Our fence lines were so covered. So 46 days from then, it's like, oh my gosh, we aren't going to make it. We're all going to kill ourselves. And Jay, yours was out to past Mother's Day, if it had been correct.
I was guessing it would have been May 15th, 20th. It was May 2nd.
So it was
quickly that's
much further off than it has been. We might be off a day or two, but we're pretty close. So sorry about that. Marcia, I hate to impose, but would you mind just saying a few words about preservation of open lands?
I'd rather say something about preservation of culture.
Okay, sure.
One of my bigger concerns is we've seen so much develop here, is how we're going to preserve this culture that we call home.
Sorry, Marcia. Mary is having a hard time hearing. What if you could stand, if you don't mind?
My bigger concern, because people like Jay and so many others have worked so hard on the land preservation, is how we're going to preserve our culture. How are we going to keep what we've always treasured of our people here as we see such an influx? And I look around, see so many familiar faces that know how important that is. And how are we going to retain that question, that culture?
I'm with you. It worries me. I come to town and I think, I go to the grocery store and I come home and I tell my husband or our kids, I said, oh my gosh, I saw so and so and so and so and so and so. And we look at each other and say, oh my gosh, we're still here. You know, the community is still here. And so I have to remember that. So I'm going to finish with a little story with the idea of how important it is to preserve place, but to have a sense of propriety of place. Like, how do we do life in this culture, in the landscape of this culture, this community? So, this essay is called The Heart Seas of Long Gulch. And I'm not going to read, I'm just going to read a couple little excerpts out of here. But the basic story is about my walking on County Road 56 for probably, I don't know, over 3 decades. And I know all my neighbors. Everybody slows down, everybody says hello, shares a story, until one day. When the chatter of my daily life slips into a din, I often walk down our county road. Heading first south, County Road 56 intersects our ranch before it turns west through the heart of Long Gulch, where it cooperates with the train like an old walking path. I'm usually not alone. I'm accompanied by my loyal companions, Emma and Grizz. We've walked together for a decade. Emma leads the pack, and Grizz follows from behind, ever the herding dog. My companions are each the dog of our lifetimes. So the saying goes, one spirit connecting in a way no other animal has. My dog Emma believes she can do anything. In the drive, a strong will I admire. Grizz, Pete's dog, is a fierce, if need be, lover boy. Pete knows he'll never have another grizzly bear, so when we travel together, we're a tight-knit trio. We intuit the other, we protect the other. Our walks were without incident until a few years ago when a small white Toyota pickup came upon us at a very high rate of speed. I didn't see or hear him coming until the last minute. I tried frantically to wave him down so I could gather up Emma and Grizz. I feared he'd run over Emma, who was the least likely to get out of the way. Grizz would take care of himself, but the driver didn't make any attempt to move over or slow down. I felt an old protective mother bear roar inside. I cursed and shouted at him, "You stupid son of a..." You could have killed my dogs. But the words simply sailed on down the road. Whatever the driver saw ahead of him apparently didn't register as a human being with dogs on the side of the road. Even though I couldn't identify the driver, I knew he wasn't like the neighbors I've come to know as friends. They slow down, they move over, they say hello. So, I want to share with you a quote again from Scott Russell Sanders, writing in Earthworks, on the propriety of place. If our fidelity to place is to help renew and preserve our neighborhoods, it will have to be informed by what Wendell Berry in Standing by Words calls an ecological intelligence, a sense of the impossibility of acting or living alone or solely on one's behalf, and this rests in turn upon a sense of the order upon which any life depends, and of the proprieties of place within that order. Proprieties of place, actions, words, and values that are proper to our home ground. So the end of the story is, the driver of the white pickup one day, I'd been watching for him, and my daughter-in-law, I watched for him a lot. This was over a long period of time, and he really put everyone at the ranch at risk at one time or another. I still was beside myself about what to do about it. I figured out who he was and so on. And one afternoon, I knew that Alicia in the back and my granddaughter, Collins, were walking down the road. And I thought, oh my gosh. I worried all the time when they walked down the road. I thought, surely he'll slow down. And he didn't. He dusted them off. So I went in and called the sheriff. And I said, you know, XYZ, gave my report, told him who he was. So that was that. There wasn't much they could do. They did serve him a warning. And then I had to leave it. You know, I tried to leave it, even though, you know, you can't do something about it like that. So a week or so later, I get a phone call. And I pick it up, and it says, hello, this is John. I hear you have a problem with my driving. And I'm going to paraphrase the conversation. I said, well, yeah, as a matter of fact, you've really put all of us at risk. And he defended himself for a little while. And I said, well, you know, the sheriff knows about it. This has been going on. And then just like that, he said, you know, I'm sorry. I apologize. And I said, John, I accept your apology. And he said, I'm honored you accept my apology. We visited for a little while. And at the end of the conversation, I said, you know, I'm out on the road, still out on the road. I've never met you. If you have a chance, would you please stop by and introduce yourself? And I thought, what are you thinking? This guy. Why would he stop and say hello? So, you know, again, I went on. And one day, I think it was in June, early July, I'm walking down the road, and this truck comes up behind me real slow. And it's John. Stops his truck rolls down his window, and he said, "You must be Mary." I said, "Yes, and you must be John." And we had a very nice conversation. I learned a little bit about him. He learned a little bit about me. And I still see him on the road. But that's what we need. He and I survived the crisis. We survived the conflict. But it doesn't happen all the time. And I'm still not entirely sure how it is that that all transpired. But it did. But the fact that he was willing to stop and say, yeah, I can do this. I can respect you. We can get to know one another. And so in our efforts to preserve and protect, it's really a difficult thing, but both parties have to be willing to come to the table and to talk about it. And to be respectful of what, at first he thought we were really silly about worrying about his driving. But it has to go beyond that. They have to respect your concern and then be able to talk about it and move on from there. So that's my story. But thank you. I'm happy to answer any questions about writing or anything that you've heard today. Or
did you read Mary Walker's letter to the editor this week about the gravel riders on her road?
Oh, no.
Yeah.
You should. Okay.
Look it up.
I saw the sign on 56 yesterday. So, yeah. But again, thank you, Katie. Thank you, everyone, for spending an hour.